And joining us on the debate for the full hour tonight, in Columbus, Ohio, William Cunningham, psychologist at The Ohio State University. In New York, New York, Irshad Manji, professor of leadership at NYU. And here in studio, Dr. Kwame McKenzie, psychiatrist at CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and the University of Toronto. Grace Edward Galabuzzi, professor of politics at Ryerson University, and Jonathan Kay, opinion page editor at The National Post. It's great to have everybody both here and in Points Beyond on our program tonight, and I always like to do this when she's on the program because, Irshad, you and I started on this channel, gosh, I think it's almost 17 years ago now, and as always, I like to say it's great to have you back on, even from your perch in New York City. Lovely to see you again, Irshad.
I love being with you guys. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Let's start with a real simple but difficult question. What do you mean when you use the word racist? Irshad, why don't you get us started? What's racism today?
I think racism is a very simple dynamic of reducing individuals to their skin color. And what is so fascinating about politics today, Steve, is that those who claim to be progressive, those who claim to be inclusive, can be among the first and foremost racists. For example, a frankly pompous word being thrown around these days is racialized. And when I am racialized, what that means is people who call themselves progressive are viewing me through one lens, and that is the lens of my skin color. Completely neglects my multiple identities, and it reduces me to just one slice of who I am, and possibly not even the most important slice of who I am. That is racism.
Okay, Grace Edward, when you use the word, what do you mean?
Well, what I mean is, on the one hand, we're talking about actions that individuals may be responsible for, but we're also talking about institutions and in many ways we're talking about organizations. So it isn't really just about the individual, but essentially it is in many ways what Irshad has said, the attribution of a negative stereotype or value to an individual or a group of individuals or a collective on the basis of phenotype. It may be culture, it may be ethnicity, that may have a negative impact or outcomes for those individuals.
Okay, that goes well beyond what Irshad said, and we'll explore some of these differences as we go along. William Cunningham, when you use the word, what does it mean to you?
Well, the definitions that have already been stated are actually quite consistent with the way that I would consider it. Basically, it's just using some kind of a group category to make inferences about an individual, and many times when it's just not justified, when you make the inference that someone is less intelligent or is going to be incapable of performing a certain job, despite evidence to the contrary, simply as a function of some kind of arbitrary social group membership.
Okay, Kwame McKenzie?
Well, I think there are at least two things that you have to think of. There's discrimination, which is treating somebody differently because of the color of their skin or because they are from a particular religious group. But racism isn't just discrimination, it's discrimination plus power. So that's when I'm thinking about racism, I'm usually thinking about discrimination plus power. And similar to Grace said, this can be individual, interpersonal, between people, it can be between groups, or it can be by institutions. So it's a very complex concept, but discrimination plus power is usually a good place to start.
John Kay, once upon a time, the worst thing you could call somebody was a communist. Right. Now the worst thing you can call them is a racist. When you use that word, what does that mean to you?
Well, it's a reductionist concept, kind of like communist, kind of like fascist. The word fascist had a fashion a couple of decades ago. I have a very old school mentality toward racism. I use the word in the way I think it would be recognized by people in the 60s. Racism is the habit of classifying people according to skin color, creating hierarchies of merit based on that skin color, and treating them differently according to law, according to that hierarchy you've created.
One of the reasons we're talking about this today, Grace Edward, is because your university, Ryerson University, published an anti-racism report. Yes. You're on the task force, you're co-chair of the task force, in fact, and I want to read, I guess the report came out a couple of months ago, and I want to read just one excerpt to start with here to get us further along the road to our discussion. The word racism, again from the final report, is commonly used to refer to instances in which an individual or group is intentionally targeted for negative treatment on the basis of skin color, culture, religion, or such other group-based characteristics. Racism often involves individuals or groups with power and privilege acting in a manner that leads to differential outcomes for members of a particular group. However, such a conceptualization is limited since racialized outcomes often do not require racist actors. Now, again, going by all of the definitions we've heard today, some might say that's a pretty broad definition of racism that doesn't include just skin color, as Irshad put it, but also religion, race, for example, anti-Muslim racism, there's religion in there. So the word racism today, can it be used beyond the idea of race, from which presumably it comes?
Well, the word race has always been used to signify more than skin color. It has been used to signify, if you go back to the history of the word race, you find that the early uses of race actually did not represent skin color. They represented culture. They represented other ways of defining collectives. So race has been and continues to be applied to differentiations in communities and societies that in many cases now we understand to be based on skin color, but has always included others. So the issue of race with regard to religion, which is what you raise, the issue, for instance, of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, that's not new. There's nothing new about using race to define a religious collective.
All right, let me get some others on this. Irshad, in your view, does that definition as enunciated by the Ryerson Task Force go too far?
I think it does, and it also, I think, negates the fact, Steve, that, as I said in my opening statement, that many racists today reduce people to one aspect of their wholeness out of positive intentions, or what they believe are positive intentions. In other words, positive stereotypes and not just negative stereotypes are being promoted, and yet they are still stereotypes. And we need to call out stereotypes regardless of what value is attached to them. Because when you stereotype, you reduce individuals to something less than their complicated whole selves. And what that does is it also demeans diversity. It turns diversity into a glorification of the group rather than an appreciation of the complex individual.
Kwame McKenzie?
I think she's right that there's a problem with regards to sort of discrimination. But I think that we've got to get back to the idea of racism. Racism isn't discrimination, just being able to, even if we're talking about just one aspect of people, it's taking that and actually there being some sort of negative consequence from it. So it's discrimination plus power.
Can I just understand with the plus power aspect of it? Given that the majority of the people in this country, Canada, are white, does that mean white people cannot be the victims of racism?
No, it depends on where the power is. So, I mean, it is completely possible for a white person to be the victim of racism if there's discrimination and that discrimination is used for a negative intent. But if people are actually trying to do something positive, it's quite difficult to say that that is racism. It is definitely discrimination, and people talk about positive discrimination as they've used in the States, but most people wouldn't class that as racism. And so I think if we don't define our terms properly, we can get into some sort of pretty mucky ground.
Exactly, which is why I'm going to get to the two others here in the studio in a second, but Will, let me follow up with you on this. We're starting to hear definitions of racism that go beyond race. It also includes religion. And I guess I want to know from you, are you comfortable with, the definition of racism going beyond simple race?
Definitely. The problem that I think we are all facing is that, these words have so many meanings, so many connotations. The way that we mean them scientifically varies across different fields. And I worry sometimes, it's already been stated, that by not having precise terms for what we mean by things, we first of all can call things, oftentimes we can call something racist. Oftentimes that can kind of close down conversations, and they're real problems. And in psychology, we typically distinguish between stereotypes, which are simply the beliefs that a certain group has some characteristic. Prejudice, which is the liking or disliking of someone as a member of a group, and discrimination, which is acting on these beliefs. And one thing that's interesting is that when you're talking about these different groups, some people can experience stereotyping without the prejudice component, some people can experience the prejudice without the stereotyping component. And I think that we need to get a much better handle on what we mean by these words when we're using them.
Let's continue to try to do that here. John Kay.
Steve?
Sorry, I think that the big issue is contained in the passage you read from the Ryerson report. And to me, the issue isn't so much how you academically describe the boundaries of racism, whether it includes, say, Jews or Muslims or gays, for instance. To me, it's whether you confuse intent and effect. And the words you read from the Ryerson report very explicitly blur the line between racist intent and what is perceived to be a racialized outcome. And once you do that, that's very dangerous. And this is a conceptual problem that emerged in the 80s and 90s, the era of political correctness, when people would take a snapshot of something and say, look, there aren't enough blacks, there aren't enough Jews, there aren't enough Muslims, there aren't enough whatever in that particular group, there must be some kind of bigoted attempt. To me, the classic example is a couple of years ago, the Toronto Star looked at the composition of the Toronto Blue Jays baseball team, and they found, I think there was like 20% blacks in the major leagues and only 15% blacks on the Toronto Blue Jays, and they ran a headline that said, "White Jays." And the whole article was about the supposedly racist overtones of the Blue Jays, simply because there was this inequality in outcome. You shift a couple of players around and suddenly it's the Black Jays, I suppose. But to me, that symbolized this intellectual sloppiness when you confuse outcome and intent.
Grace Edward, then Irshad.
I think it's really important for us to not lose the ground on the issue of intent. There is now significant jurisprudence. The Supreme Court has ruled on this issue, Human Rights Commission, other bodies, authoritative bodies have ruled on the issue of intent. Intent is important, but the outcome is perhaps even more important, because the reality is that racism does not simply work on the basis of an individual intending to act in a certain way. It goes beyond that. It goes to how institutions are structured, to how the particular institutional arrangements that lead to certain outcomes. Those may not necessarily reflect the intent of the individual, but they either reproduce or continue a pattern that leads to outcomes
So intent
that have
doesn't matter.
negative. Not that intent doesn't matter, but intent cannot be the standard. We have to go beyond intent. We have to look at outcomes.
Irshad.
Well, I want to pick up on what Will said about shutting down conversation. I think most of us in society in general can agree that for people to understand one another, we have to be able to converse with one another. So when you extend the notion of racism to, for example, asking uncomfortable questions about somebody's chosen religious beliefs, and the person who's being asked those questions immediately throws up a wall and says, "You're being racist for even asking those questions," conversation simply can't unfold. I remember, Steve, a couple of years ago, receiving an email from a French Acadian woman named José, who said to me that I want to be able to engage women who choose to wear the hijab. I want to be able to dialogue with them, but I am told that I have no authority to ask them questions about it, and therefore suspicions about them will only, deepen. In other words, if we're not willing to engage in conversation, despite the risk of being called racist for doing so, then the gap between us and them actually widens.
Kwame.
I think the conversation's important. I think that it's important for people to be open, but I also think that if people are going to have a proper conversation, they have to have an equal conversation. And so if there is a power problem, if people are worried and concerned that you don't have an equal conversation, and that's sometimes why people throw up their arms and say, well, just a second, I'm uncomfortable about this is racism or whatever, and it's because of some of the history that has happened before. But I actually wanted to go back to the idea of intent. Mm-hmm. It is completely possible for an organisation to produce discriminatory outcomes and without being able to find anybody who intended to do so. In fact, in finding a whole group of people who'd be horrified if everyone said that they were intending to be discriminatory. And there was an interesting case in the UK, a famous case in the UK that changed UK law, and the judge was Macpherson, who looked into the death of Stephen Lawrence, a young kid who died at the hands of racist thugs on the streets of London, and his family did not get proper service by the police. No one was ever found guilty of this murder. When the judge looked into it, and this was a very large inquiry, he found that the Metropolitan Police in London were institutionally racist. He specifically said that he could find no act of racism by any officer, but as an organisation together, they clearly dropped the ball because of the way they looked into cases of young black people dying.
I am going to come back to this issue of intention because it is key, but I want to play, and I know everybody wants to get in, but I got some tape I got to play here first. We do a little program here on this network called Flying Solo, and Nalo Hopkinson is a Toronto-based science fiction writer, and she had some things to say about the anger that surrounds a lot of the issues that we're talking about today. We'll roll this tape, we'll come back, we'll talk a bit. Michael, if you would, roll the tape.
In this part of the world, to be racist is to mention race. There's such an offense sensitivity that a lot of people have seemed to have decided that the way to not be racist is to not talk about it. The worst thing you can do is tell someone they are racist. It's not whether or not it's true, it's that you have said it. They get all offended that you even would think it. But we live in a racist world. How do you operate in isolation? To some extent, I'm racist, you're racist. We have these assumptions that we have to keep challenging ourselves. It's not a crime to have them, it's a crime to not challenge them. And so the anger gets to be part of the discussion, I think.
We move from that anger to another example I want to put on the table, and then we'll discuss. Canadian Federation of Students, they just published a report about all this. A biochemistry student at Trent University said that he felt he needed to work much harder than the average student to get the attention of his professor because, quote, it's really hard when I'm the only brown person in the class. Let's start, Grace Edward, with you on this. How do we know that the difficulty that this student is having, and obviously it made him angry that he felt he had to deal with this double standard of play here, how do we know that the difficulty he's having with his professor is because his skin is brown?
We know, it's hard to speak to that particular individual experience, but we know that there is sufficient literature to suggest that both through surveys, perception surveys, but also through quantitative research, that individuals who are identifiable in particular ways, and it may not necessarily just be race or religion, but particular ways, often have a difficulty operating in an environment where the norms that essentially are defined by the majority group.
So history tells us that that's probably the case.
History tells us. I can tell you that from the research that we did for our own report, that these issues were raised, have been raised by a number of students. For instance, students who wear a hijab who are clearly identifiably Muslim.
Let me get Irshad and then John Kay on that. Irshad,
let me just finish
example. Okay, I got to show the
but I'm
time
just
here,
saying,
Grace Edwards, so
students
quickly.
who are identifiably Muslim, having difficulty in classes where a whole variety of discussions are going on that are based on particular assumptions about what a Muslim is or what Muslim culture is.
Well, let's go to a Muslim. Go ahead, Irshad, you got the floor.
Well, you know, my great worry about all of this, Steve, is that we're raising a generation of what I would call racial trust fund babies. Individuals who can inherit a given identity and then lazily rely on that one identity for the rest of their lives as if that's a summation of all that they are and all that they're capable of. You know, no, it's not a cheap shot at all. No, not at all. I mean, you might be offended by my characterization of the trust fund baby aspect because, you know, you're so anti-classist, but that's the reality of what we're doing to these young people. And I say that we ought to have higher expectations of them and actually, you know, remind them that the hard work of self-awareness is indeed hard. That's why when you're feeling uncomfortable in a classroom because the professor has said something that, doesn't jibe with your own beliefs, use your mind. Women who wear the hijab always say, appreciate me for my mind, not for the way I look. Then use your mind and ask more questions.
Let me get John Kay. John, the suggestion here from Grace Edward is that history proves to us that if there's one brown person in a class and he or she feels awkward or uncomfortable about having to work extra hard to get the attention of the professor, it's probably because there's some either unintentional or intentional racism going on. What do you say
I
to
have
that?
two problems with that. The first is that it creates a cult of victimization, whereby any setback is immediately traced to some phantasm of institutional racism. Racism becomes a sort of conspiracy theory in which if you fail or if you feel that you've been negatively affected for any number of complex reasons, your reflex recourse is to say this must be racist. And that creates a cult of victimization, as Irshad was saying. I have a big problem with that. The second problem with it is it's ahistorical. If you look at the Jewish experience in early 20th century America, Russian Jews, East European Jews, they were stigmatized horribly, and yet they prospered in the educational system, notwithstanding the racism or anti-Semitism, which no doubt existed on orders of magnitude greater than what we see now. You see it in East Asian immigrants in the California school system and our own school system.
Some will argue, though, John, that Jews can pass in a white society in a way that
okay, well,
blacks can't.
let's look at East Asians in the California school system. The idea that these people walk into a classroom and immediately become victims of some sort of oppressive stigma and therefore fail is completely belied by the data. I mean, this is a conscious intellectual effort to turn racism into an invisible and therefore all-explanatory theory for any failure for a disadvantaged group.
Let me get Will and then Kwame, and then we'll go back to Grace Edward to wrap up this segment. Go ahead.
Well, it's really tricky because at one level we know that at the group level these prejudices occur. We know that on average someone will not be treated necessarily as well as somebody else, just as a function of skin color or social group. But the problem is whenever we try to look at the specific example, any behavior is so ambiguous as to what the actual causes were. And there's even research now showing that the people who end up being sometimes the most awkward in dealing in racial interactions tend to be the lowest prejudiced people, mainly because they're so concerned about looking prejudiced that they actually will make less eye contact. They will actually engage in behaviors that look very, very racist because they're trying their best not to look racist. And so there's an interesting dynamic here that I think we've been coming around to, which is, how do we have a conversation when we know these disparities exist, we know these prejudices exist, but in the individual situation where we can kind of find out what's going on and how to best deal with the individual situation?
Kwame McKenzie.
We don't know exactly what was happening with that young student. We don't know whether it was racism or not.
We know the student thought it was.
We know the student thought it was, and that's important, but we don't know why the student thought it was, and it would be important to actually find that out. We also know that racism exists, and we know that young black kids don't do so well in school, and there's a lot of evidence showing that that is partly due to racism. So we're not actually anywhere near producing a group of victims, we're a victim culture, but society is victimizing a group of people. And so I take exception to the idea that we're sort of nannying a group of people through society that isn't racist, which is nonsense, or that we're producing a bunch of victims who aren't being victimized, which is another nonsense. Yeah? They are all part truths of a complex problem. Yeah? But we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We've got to recognize that racism exists and something needs to be done about it. We also got to realize that some people ascribe racism where there isn't racism, but that doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist. It's a facile argument. So we need to take it, we need to get a bit of depth in thinking through these sorts of things.
Grace Edward.
In fact, what we found in our environmental survey at Ryerson University was that only 28% of racialized students said they were significantly concerned about racism.
Can I stop you there for a second? There's a word
this.
that's been used a couple of times already and I think also needs a little bit of description. Racialized.
Yes.
This is a very new word, relatively speaking.
Relatively speaking, but it's not particularly new, but it is a recognition of...
What does it mean?
What it essentially means is that we're talking about individuals who are essentially the subject of a process, the process being racialization, that is responsible for defining their role in society, okay? So it goes back to my initial definition, which is the attribution of a negative value to certain characteristics.
So just so I'm really clear here, when you say racialized, essentially, is it a synonym for being black or being Asian or being Muslim, or is that what it means?
Well, what it means essentially in the Canadian context is that group of individuals and communities that are referred to as visible minorities.
Well, let me just check this with Irshad. Okay, I'm going to come back to you because I want to. I'm going to come back to the point, but I want to check this with Irshad. Irshad, you are a member of, I think, at least 3 identifiable groups that are considered, from time to time, victimized in our society, right? Female, lesbian, Muslim. Are you racialized?
If I am, I certainly don't feel racialized, Steve. I am a complex, multifaceted individual who, expects my fellow citizens, whether I'm in the U.S. or in Canada, where I'm still a citizen, to also live up to all that they are, including the contradictions of what they are. This is what it means to live in a pluralistic society. It's not merely about diversity of that which we've inherited or our biological traits or our appearance. It's also diversity of thinking, diversity above the neck. That's when diversity becomes most meaningful.
Okay, thank you for that. Grace Edward, finish your point.
Let me just finish, because I think it's really important. I think we need to respond to the mischaracterization that Irshad made with regard to the experience of racism. We're talking about students here, the majority of who, although they are from racialized populations, did not even actually identify as being concerned, sufficiently concerned about racism. A minority did, and a minority of those students are really concerned about how racism impacts their ability to function effectively at the university. There's no evidence to suggest that racialized people are using racism to shirk the responsibility of being competitive, whether it's at the university or in the labor market. There's every evidence to suggest that the implications or the impacts of racism in their lives are very real when you look at a whole range of socioeconomic indicators that show that they are both losing ground and having a hard time competing effectively and equally. The problem is not the individuals. The problem are the structures that are in place.
I don't know. Can I tell you something? I read his blog. John Kay did a piece on this in the National Post, and somebody who I think self-described as Asian submitted a comment in your blog and said, you know, there's so much white guilt in this society and I take advantage of it all the time.
So there are individuals who do that. But look, the reason why I give the example of 28% is to suggest to you that it is not the case that a majority of people who are racialized are running around saying, I'm taking advantage of white guilt.
Okay.
That's not what's happening.
Let me just, I want to, go ahead, Kwame, and then I want to put something to John.
Just to get this racialized idea in my mind, because we're here talking about race. Race is a social construct. Why is the color of anybody's skin important? It's only important, you know, not because black is better than white or whatever. It's only important when society makes it important. And that's what the idea of racialization is. It's that race itself, you know, what does it matter what the color of your skin is? It only matters when you're in a certain context. It's not you, it's a context you're in. You are being racialized by that context.
Understood. John, let me put this example to you. This is also from the Ryerson report. A Jewish student reports that a classroom debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict put him in the position of being the only one supporting Israel because the other 3 Jewish students there wouldn't, because they, quote, didn't feel comfortable and didn't want to be singled out by anyone or judged. How does the unwillingness to debate fall under the purview, do you think, of this anti-racism task force, or are we going a little far afield here?
I think we might be going far afield because right now, I think in most Western societies, anti-Semitism, bald-faced anti-Semitism of the type that existed decades ago is so out of fashion that I think, at least on college campuses, it's a fairly marginal phenomenon, except in highly radicalized Islamist constituencies. What it has morphed into is a political phenomenon, which is anti-Israel activism. And anti-Israel activism, I think, has to be understood as a political phenomenon, and to a certain extent, to the extent it's espoused by radical Muslim groups, it's a religious phenomenon. I don't think it goes with our anti-racism discussion, although I was pleased to see it included in the Ryerson report, because I think it is one of the things that makes certain groups on campus feel very uncomfortable.
Grace Edward, quickly.
What we heard from a number of Jewish students was that when these issues were being discussed in class, often they had difficulty engaging because they felt that their opinion was a minority opinion. But that's not just what was happening. They also felt that expressing a minority opinion might have implications in terms of their relationship with other students, as well as their relationship with the relationship with the instructor. They were concerned that they would be marked negatively.
That's a problem in academia. But if I say something with my colleagues, or if I'm in school and I say something that evokes a strong response to the people I work with or study with, and they think what I say is wrong, of course they're going to have a strong response, and of course it's going to affect their perception of me. And this is a broader problem I have with the campaign against, the militant campaign against racism and other forms of bigotry, is that in a sense it's a utopian idea which seeks to eradicate all forms of judgment. So for instance, when Irshad was talking about how people simply cannot criticize the choice to wear the burqa or the hijab anymore because it is seen as a species of bigotry. People's choices have consequences, and if you take whole areas of discourse and say, well, this you can't say this because this is a form of bigotry, then what you're doing is you're saying we want a society with no conflict at all. When people make controversial statements...
It's hard for me to accept that proposition when the government of Quebec has just put forward legislation that prohibits the use of the burqa in public places, at least for the purposes of public services. So the idea that the problem
Look
here
how they had to justify it. They had to justify it under security,
they should have to
under
justify
communication. They had to justify it with a whole bunch of weasel words, which took away from the fact that...
Stand by, gentlemen. I want to get let me get Irshad on this, and then Kwame.
You know, it's exactly because, Grace Edward, we live in that kind of a context today that the need for more conversations, individuals speaking with other individuals, is more urgent than ever. And when you're, you know, saying, well, when you're saying that, or not you, sorry, when one is saying that, well, I know I can't ask a question about X because, you know, that person will consider me a racist. Ultimately, what you are doing is denying that person their individual personal agency. You are stripping them of the ability to rise above emotions and to actually engage in dialogue with maturity. That, to me, is infantilizing the very person whom you claim to be respecting.
But that is not the dominant position.
I got to let Kwame in here first.
But I think it's interesting, everybody's making interesting points, but some of the things that I want to slip away from is the question of choice and whether you should be able to discuss people's choice, because racism usually isn't about choice. So I currently cannot, well, actually I've just been in makeup, and because I've been in makeup, I have chosen my skin colour. But before that time, I wasn't able to change my skin colour at all. And so I was then racial, you know, how people treat me is not because of a choice I've made, it's because of how I was born and who I am. And most of racism and discrimination we're talking about is not about people making choices. And if people make choices, as Jonathan says, in a proper pluralistic society, you should be able to discuss those choices and people should defend them. But racism usually isn't about the choice I've made. It's about the stereotype that I've been ascribed due to something that often actually I can't change. And that, I think, is the nub of the problem.
Let me introduce a new idea here, something called micro-inequity. And where would you go for a definition of this? Wikipedia, of course. Apparently, according to Wikipedia, small events which are often ephemeral and hard to prove, events which are covert, often unintentional, frequently unrecognized by the perpetrator, which occur wherever people are perceived to be, quote-unquote, different. That's micro-inequity. Irshad, can I go to you first on this? Has that ever happened to you?
I can give you an example.
Okay, Kwame, I'll come to you next.
I'm still confused. I mean, I about this particular definition. What does it mean that if somebody is on a cell phone and I've approached that person with a question and he or she just needs to finish up the conversation on the cell phone and I consider that rude, have I somehow been discriminated against? Is that, I'm asking a sincere question, it's not a statement, is that what qualifies as micro inequity?
Now, you're really not being facetious with that one?
No.
Okay, Kwame,
I'm no
help her out.
trust fund baby on this one.
Okay.
Irshad, it's more like me going into Sears and deciding I'm going to take the elevator to the third floor. I walk into
Kwame,
the
don't
elevator.
say Sears, just say a store. You're going to get us in big trouble here. Okay.
By saying Sears.
Well, let's not just identify, unless you have reason to think that this is an issue here.
No,
at
actually,
Sears.
no, and it's not an issue at all to do with Sears at all.
Okay.
It says,
Don't say any company. Just
no company.
Any
just
department store.
Some high-class
Going to
department
get a
store.
suit here. Okay.
Sorry, I walk into a high-class department store,
There you
and when
go.
I walk into that high-class department store, I decide I need to take the elevator onto the third floor. I go into the elevator. As I'm walking into the elevator, there are 3 women there. They all pull their bags a bit closer to them. Yeah. I look at that and I think, well, is that something to do with the fact that I'm a guy? Is it to do with the fact that I'm black and I'm walking in this high-class department store? What is going on there? Yeah. These are the sorts of things that people talk about when they're talking about microaggressions or micro inequities. And the idea is you see it. It's a normal event. You then think, is this something to do with the way people view me, the colour of my skin or whatever? And that sort of makes you a little bit anxious. And then you can't really do anything about it. Because if you were to speak to those women and say, just a second, have you pulled this?
No. I have to interject here for just one second. Of course you can do something about it. You can do something with it, which is ask those women in the elevator, did I just see something that I just need some clarification on? Each of you pulled your purse closer to you. Is that because of me? I just need to know.
Yeah,
That's
but
not
the reason
the
reason why you can't do that, apart from the fact that it's an incredibly aggressive thing to do, the reason why you can't do that.
Why is it aggressive? If you're feeling anxious,
Well,
aren't you entitled to a response of some kind?
Just a second. If you do go into that lift, and if that does happen, and if people are trying to do it covertly, and then you say, hey, have you got a problem, or whatever you're going to say,
No.
or even if you start the conversation saying, I just noticed you've pulled your purses closer to you, that's made me a little bit anxious, that will almost undoubtedly make the situation worse.
Let me get Will in here, because I haven't heard Will for a while. Will, now you're a psychologist, so I want the psychological angle here. Can the micro inequity that we just described, the elevator scene, have macro effects? Talk to us about that.
Definitely. Well, first of all, we're talking about this in a very deliberate way. What's interesting about the psychological research is most people don't realize that they've actually pulled the bag closer to them. They don't realize that they are using a slightly different tone of voice, or they don't realize that they're actually engaging in these kind of behaviors that kind of distance with the other person. So confronting them, they might not even realize they've done any of these things, despite the fact they've very obviously, done them. And what a lot of the research tends to show is that people don't feel welcome, they don't feel comfortable, and that there tends to be a cascading effect. That if you're not feeling comfortable, you're not as attentive to other other situation. And there's a term called the stereotype threat, which actually shows that when people feel like they might be stereotyped, they actually even perform worse on tests, exams, on objective measures. And you can pick up these things from the environment. And what's critical is the fact that people who are making the person feel unwelcome don't even realize they're doing it.
Huh. Okay, Grace Edward and then John.
I was just going to say another example is you're on the train and you're sitting down and or you go to sit down somewhere and someone gets up and leaves. The reality is that they may be leaving because of any number of reasons. What often happens is if that happens to you a number of times, you start to wonder whether that's about you. And it does have a psychological effect on you. You start to hesitate when it comes to either going to sit down or engaging in a public discourse, because you start to question yourself. The other dimension to this, by the way, is that when we get to talking about racial profiling by police forces and by institutions, right? There are connections between these processes and the kinds of decisions that are made by people who have authority based on their assumptions about, and we'll probably speak to this best, their assumptions about what nature of threat particular individuals pose.
John Kay.
I'd like to just step back. I'm feeling a stereotype threat myself because my status as a white man. So let me step back to make it sort of a macro issue here.
Are you saying right now?
Yeah. Sorry, what, micro
It
inclusiveness?
isn't just about you.
Micro inclusiveness?
Inequity.
Micro inequity.
Yeah.
Here's how I see micro inequity. Civil rights era, there was a very effective backlash against bald-faced discrimination and racism. And it was largely successful. We now live in an era, we have a black president of the United States, we have a black governor general, we have the most popular entertainment icon in the Western world, Oprah Winfrey is black, one of the most popular athletes, Tiger Woods. We have tens.
Not sure he's the most
maybe,
popular
yeah,
anymore,
okay.
but anyway, I get you.
Tens of millions of suburban kids all around the Western world trying to emulate black styles of music and entertainment. So the battle against bald-faced discrimination has been largely won. However, you still have activists and academics extremely well invested in the idea that many of the problems facing our society are the same problems that faced our society 50 years ago. And so there is what might be called an ideological witch hunt for microscopic, invisible remnants of this horrible ideology that thankfully we have largely purged from our
Just
from
while
our
you have the floor, I
ideological
want you to follow
landscape.
up on this because you did the piece, you went to those seminars.
Yep.
Thinking about whiteness and doing anti-racism. This was the workshop that you participated in.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, I think I don't know if you got called, but the theory that was being espoused was something called democratic racism.
Democratic racism.
What was that?
Democratic racism is the idea that the ostensibly race-neutral, colorblind principles that undergird our society, such as freedom of speech, majority rule, due process, that these are infected with the residue of racism because when they operate to the advantage of the majority group. So for instance, an example that was much paraded in the class was that someone makes an accusation of racism but they don't have any proof, you should still hear this person out because the whole idea of due process can act as a form of democratic racism in that you are excluding someone because they don't meet the evidentiary standards that our majority society has set up.
What's your issue with that?
My issue with that is that people in our society are either governed by a set of laws and a set of principles or they're not. And if they demand exception to those neutral principles because of fashionable theories like anti-racism, then they're essentially asking for special privileges based on skin color, which is racist.
Lots of feedback here. Irshad first, Kwame, then Grace
Yeah.
Edward.
Let me now that I understand what micro inequity means, let me weigh in with this. John mentioned Oprah Winfrey, icon of not just African American success but American success. Interestingly enough, early on in her success, many black academics accused her of being what is called a mammy, which is a historical reference to, the female house Negro who was tasked with looking after the master's children rather than her own. And what they were referring to was that the micro inequity on her part, Oprah's part, of paying more attention to cultivating white audiences than black audiences. Oprah herself was terribly hurt by this accusation, but instead of becoming defensive about it, she consulted with a few friends and then went on record to say this, that just because you are part of my culture does not give you the right to decide for me who I am. And she finished off that declaration by saying, once I got that, I was free.
She's not free of Kitty Kelly yet, but she's free of the rest of it, I guess.
So I think,
Okay, Kwame, go
I
ahead.
think there are important things just from an academic point of view. If you are the victim of racism, so a racist assault or racist abuse, you have an increased risk of mental health problems, both anxiety, depression, and psychosis. You also don't live as long, so you have a decreased life expectancy. If you believe that society is racist and you have had and you have been the victim of discrimination, you also have a decreased life expectancy and you also have an increased risk of developing a mental health problem. That is true for racism. It is true of sexism as well. These are There's a lot of research that shows this. There's literature reviews that show this. So it is something.
So it's incumbent upon us to...
It's incumbent on us to realise, one, it exists, but also that this idea that because there's a black president, somehow that means that there's no, that there isn't discrimination in the US, and somehow the civil rights...
Say that.
And somehow the civil rights work is over, and that academics are somehow looking for something to do.
He did say that.
Yeah, is not actually borne out by the statistics. The statistics show that despite the civil rights movement, though a small group of Americans who are black have moved on, a lot have not. And it's the same in most countries around the world. And that's why people are interested in this subject, not because they're trying to feather their own nests.
Grace Edward.
I think that one of the difficulties that I'm having with this conversation is the extent to which we're trivializing the claims that are being made by people whose experiences we have not heard sufficiently about. In the case of the individual that John was talking about, yes, I think we want to hear from those individuals, because guess what? It may well be the case that the standards that are being used to measure racism are not sufficient. For instance, I recognize that we have made progress, but there are also real ongoing difficulties that we face. In Ontario, racialized groups, racialized families are 26% of the population. They're 45% of people living in poverty. Okay? Kwame earlier on talked about black kids in the schools, in the school system. 42% of them do not complete their high school, right? We have a variety of issues in housing, in health, in education, in the criminal justice system, all of which suggest that the experience of racialized groups is differential in significant ways. And we can't just simply walk away from that simply because an interaction between two individuals might sound suspicious, and because one person might or might not have claimed that racism is a characteristic of that individual. We need to talk about the structural issues and the structural outcomes that essentially suggest, because race, by the way, race and racism are dynamic processes. They reinforce those outcomes, and you end up with people making decisions in employment based on what they assume the human quality value, human capital value of the individuals are, precisely because they happen to be.
Okay. 2 minutes to go.
Groups.
John Kay.
Sure. First of all, I just want to clarify, I wasn't accusing intellectuals and activists of feathering their nest. What I was accusing them of is of being beholden to what, to my mind, is a slightly obsolete ideology.
And the two are very different. Wait, you have to deal with.
Let him finish.
I want to address what your point before. The statistics that you cite are terrible. But one thing that disturbs me is the logical slipshod method of saying, here are statistics that show inequality in effect, and very casually inferring from that the idea that there's some sort of racist intent. You have to respect the fact
I'm not talking
that
about intent.
individual decision, it might not even be structural or institutional racism. You have to respect the fact that people make decisions that are sometimes bad for decisions about single parenthood, decisions about education, decisions about employment, decisions about cultural values, and these have nothing to do necessarily with white racism.
Numbers. They don't explain those huge numbers.
Okay, that's
they
a
cannot
subject
explain
for
those
another
huge
show,
numbers.
You know what? The sad truth of this discussion is we spent practically the whole hour on it, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. There is so much to talk about. I really think we got to get this group back and reconvene and continue the discussion, which we have started today, and hopefully we'll continue another time. Can I thank all of our guests for appearing on the program today? William Cunningham, the psychologist from The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Will, thanks for being there on the line. Irshad Manji, as always, a delight to have you on. Professor of Leadership, NYU. Come back and visit us again sometime, Irshad. Here in studio, Jonathan Kay on the left side from the National Post, Grace Edward Galabuzzi from Ryerson University on the right, and Kwame McKenzie, the psychiatrist from CAMH and the University of Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.